Hello, I'm Denise Roberts Hurlin, Director of Classical Action, a program of Broadway Cares Equity Fights AIDS, and welcome to our Hamlen-Palm Series Classical Conversations with Sasha Cooke, Jake Heggie, and Nico Muhly. The illustrious, brilliant, and magnetic Charles Hamlen founded classical action in 1993 in response to the devastation the AIDS epidemic was having on the music community. And in 1995, joined Broadway Cares. Classical Action's signature fundraising events are intimate house concerts with world-renowned artists, and for the past decade have been hosted by Simon Yates and Kevin Roone at their beautiful Tribeca home in New York City. Actually, the last live event we produced here for Classical Action and Broadway Cares was at a concert at their home with Lisette Oropesa on March 2nd, 2020. Today, our series is moves online, and I think it offers a wonderful window into hearing a different voice from so many talented classical musicians, singers, and most importantly, too, composers who we don't normally get to hear from at our normal concerts. On behalf of my colleague, Development Officer Knox Martin, and myself, I want to thank our generous Hamlen-Palm Series supporters for making this free series possible. At the platinum level, we have David Hyde Pierce and Brian Hargrove. At gold level, Helen Bodian and Roger Alkley, Judy and Stephen Gluckstern, Kevin Roone and Simon Yates, Sarah and Howard Solomon, Seth Tribble, and David Van Such. And at silver level, we have Susan Tanaka and Louis Alexander. For those of you joining us tonight who have not made a donation yet, possibly, but would love to do so, please go to classicalaction.org/Hamlen-Palm. Okay, now I'd like to welcome our Executive Director for Broadway Cares, Tom Viola.
Hi, everybody. It's great to cyber see you all. Thank you for joining us here this evening for this classical conversation. I know that Charlie Hamlen would be thrilled that we have continued his legacy, not only beyond his passing, but certainly in the midst of the tremendous challenges of the shutdown and COVID-19. Charlie was a great champion of ours. I remember first meeting him when he came to us with what he wanted to do with classical action and how eager he was for us to join forces together so that we could really trade turf for impact and make a difference in the lives of folks not only living with HIV/AIDS, but certainly now around any number of debilitating illnesses, and now in the last year, most especially COVID-19. So thank you for joining us. Denise has asked me just to give you all an idea of what we've been able to do, not around the fundraising so much here, but what the grant making has been since literally the shutdown smacked us on March 12th. What's now, it's hard to believe, a year and a month or so ago. Since that time, well, first of all, I should let you know that essentially the money that you help us raise goes two directions. Half goes to the Actors Fund, which is the employee assistance program of the entertainment industry. And the important thing to note there is that it's not just about assisting actors, although that's certainly the legacy from their name. It's helping everybody in the entertainment industry and performing arts, whether that's on stage, behind the scenes, musicians in a pit, front of house, producers, literally everybody who makes these incredible performances happen qualify for assistance at the Actors Fund. And that certainly includes folks in the world of classical music and jazz and performance, and composers, certainly. And then we also have a national grants program where we have made awards to more than 450 organizations for years. But with COVID hitting us last March, what I'm very proud to say is we were able to sort of refit and retool everything we do, either online or as virtual events or as events such as this. And since then, we have awarded the Actors Fund over $10 million, specifically for their COVID emergency financial assistance, but also to create a new program there called Every Artist Insured. as well as sustaining the safety net of social services around mental health issues, any number of programs which are essential right now. We've also not forgotten our audiences and folks who probably and may not ever be lucky enough to walk into our concert hall stage and hear these extraordinary pieces by our guests tonight. We recently awarded $2.4 million to about 131 food service organizations all across the country. That's meal programs, food pantries, congregate meal programs. All recovery, all health really begins with a meal. Folks involved in this talk about food insecurity. What I would say is it is really just about being hungry, and how nutrition makes medication more effective and holds not only families, but communities together. So you're a part of that. We have a grant round coming up actually in May, where we hope to award maybe $2.5 million to about 300 direct service organizations all across the country. We are right now raising the money for that. You're a part of that. And that's for direct services and harm reduction programs, quality of life programs, emergency financial assistance, things that create a safety net and an aura of wellness that can make the difference in an individual's lives, in families' lives, in an entire community. So on behalf of all of us, the Broadway Cares Equity Fights AIDS and Dancers Responding to AIDS and Classical Action, and knowing that somewhere Charlie Hamlin is hovering on this Zoom, I want to thank you for joining us. And it's now my great pleasure to turn this over back to Denise.
Thank you, Tom. Yes, I know Charlie would be very proud. So next, I want to introduce someone who is the founder and managing director of Etude Arts, whose clients have appeared in the world's greatest performing arts institutions, and many have been recorded by the most distinguished media labels in the industry. Before establishing Etude Arts in 2015, he was senior vice president and IMG artist, where he served for nearly 19 years. He was recognized as an innovator by Musical America in 2016 and is on the board of directors for Opera America. But I am most grateful and lucky to call him the artistic advisor for classical action, the amazing and wonderful Bill Pallant. Thank you. Thank you, Bill.
Thank you so much, Denise, for those very generous words, and greeting from my family home in Lexington, Massachusetts. Welcome to you all. Like so many of us gathered this evening, I was a very dear friend of Charlie Hamlin. Charlie and I met in 1991 through our friend Ellen Kuzman, and not only did he help launch my career in artist management, but I actually was an enthusiastic participant at the very first envelope stuffing party for the inaugural mailer of Classical Action. Charlie, Deborah Edison, John Udry, Ellen Kuzman, myself, and a few others gathered at the then West 45th Street office of IMG Artists and stuffed and licked hundreds, if not thousands, of envelopes, which would herald the birth of Classical Action. Some of us may have been fortunate enough to be at the very first Classical Action house concert in New York, a spellbinding performance given by the late Dmitri Vorostovsky and Jean-Yves Thibaudet. And so many more of us over these many years have enjoyed countless other house concerts in New York, hosted by Michael Palm, Steve and Judy Gluckstern, and now by Kevin Roon and Simon Yates. To all gathered tonight for Classical Conversations, we're deeply appreciative of your support and your presence as we continue Charlie Hamlin's good work for the most vulnerable amongst us. I would like to take a brief moment to honor the memory of a dear friend and supporter of Classical Action, Stuart Nelson, who passed away on April 9th. Stuart, much like Charlie, was an extraordinary man whose kindness, generosity, and smile filled the room with warmth, and the entire classical music community lost a friend and a beloved patron. On behalf of Classical Action, we send our love and wishes for sweet comfort, to his beloved wife, Linda, and to the entire Nelson family. Now, it's my honor to introduce our host and our two special guest artists. Two-time Grammy Award-winning mezzo-soprano Sasha Cooke has been called a luminous standout by the New York Times, and equal parts poise, radiance, and elegant directness by Opera News. Her performances of the music of dead composers, such as Beethoven, Mozart, Berlioz, and Mahler, have been heralded by critics and audiences alike. But for the purpose of tonight's session, I'd like to draw focus on the countless songs, operas, and symphonic works that have been written specifically for Sasha Cooke by a who's who of our greatest living composers, including Joby Talbot, John Musto, Mason Bates, Laura Kaminsky, Augusta Reed Thomas, Jake Heggie, and Nico Muhly. Sasha Cooke is truly one of the great voices of our day on the world's leading stages. In addition to 8 full-length operas and several one-acts, Jake Heggie has composed nearly 300 art songs, as well as concerti, chamber music, choral, and orchestral works. Since its San Francisco opera premiere in 2000, Dead Man Walking, to a libretto by late playwright Terrance McNally, has been recorded twice and performed more than 300 times, making this incredible creation the most performed American opera of the 21st century. The Met has announced that Dead Man Walking will be given a new production in a future season, directed by Ivo van Hove and conducted by music director Yannick Nézet-Séguin. As a composer and as a distinguished pianist in his own right, Jake has made great music with the likes of Dame Kiri Te Kanawa, Patti LuPone, Audra McDonald, Frederica von Stade, Sir Bryn Tervel, the Brentano String Quartet, and longtime friends of classical action, Carol Wincenz and Lila Josefowitz. Earlier this year, Jake Heggie completed Intonations, Songs from the Violins of Hope, with text by Jean Shear, a dramatic song cycle featuring Sasha Cooke and the violinist Daniel Hope, recorded for the Pentatone label. Nico Muhly is a composer whose influences range from American minimalism to the Anglican choral tradition. The Daily Telegraph called him the world's hottest composer. He has received commissions from the Metropolitan Opera, Carnegie Hall, Los Angeles Philharmonic, Tallis Scholars, and St. John's College, Cambridge, amongst many others. His operas, Two Boys and Marnie, both have been given new production premieres at the Metropolitan Opera, and his work for stage and screen includes music for the Broadway revival of The Glass Menagerie and scores for films, including the Academy Award-winning The Reader. His compositions have been presented by the Boston Pops, the New York Philharmonic, the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, and Los Angeles Master Chorale, among many, many others. He has worked with a diverse array of artists, from Bjork to Sufjan Stevens, and from Eighth Blackbird to Anthony and the Johnsons, and he has collaborated closely with the choreographer Benjamin Millepied to create new pieces for the American Ballet Theatre, the Paris Opera Ballet, and the Dutch National Ballet. If anyone wishes to get to know Nico's music, I personally recommend the Decca label recording with the LA Master Chorale, A Good Understanding, that includes one of my favorite works by Nico, Bright Mass with Cannons. So, without further ado, it's my pleasure to welcome to Classical Conversations our host, Sasha Cooke, and our two very distinguished guests, Jake Heggie and Nico Muhly.
Thanks, Bill.
Thank you, Bill.
Thank you, Bill.
I am so thrilled to be with you guys. When they asked me to talk to both of you, I thought that talk about two of my most favorite people on the planet and favorite composers. Both of your music is on my piano right now. You are composers I want to sing. I mentioned this to a couple singers that I was going to talk with you, and often they would say, oh, they're so different. And I think that's true, but I also, for me, the first thing I thought of is how similar you are, because you both understand the voice incredibly, and you both are opera composers, and you both are incredible conversationalists, so inspiring. I mean, you should write novels. I mean, this, I don't even need to talk in this conversation, I have to tell you. And
You
you're
better.
also, I'll try. You're also people who, I mean, I have all of these text messages that are 2 lines from Nico or Jake, just an emoji, or you're very close to my heart, and I adore you. But the nerd in me, the singer in me, kind of wants to dive into that very thing I said. Why is it that I love your music? Why is it that you are known for opera? Because I think there are quite a few composers who are not great with opera. Mm-hmm. And so often I go to a new piece and I'm let down. I don't enjoy it as much. And maybe I'm expecting more because I'm a singer and because I've gotten to know a lot of new music. Maybe I have higher expectations. But I want to dive right into that question because I'm sure you have opinions about it. What makes a good opera and what makes a good opera composer? And how do both of you understand the voice so intricately as you do?
Wow. You want to go first, Nico?
No, Jake, this is all you.
First of all, Sasha's been raving about us, but my God, how lucky are we to be able to work with and write for you? You're so inspiring. And frankly, that leads me right into why I'm drawn to the voice. I've always been drawn to the voice since I was really little. When I grew up, my father was an amateur jazz sax player, but he loved big band. And so Ella Fitzgerald and Peggy Lee and Joe Stafford, and then Barbra Streisand, and then, Linda Ronstadt and Carly Simon, those, and Julie Andrews, of course, those were all the voices that were in my head, and musical theater. And I just loved the theater and the storytelling. And my sisters loved bands, but I always went for soloists. I don't know what it was about the solo voice, always went right to me. And Streisand was huge because I grew up in the 60s and 70s, and that was like the voice. But I've always been interested in that voice, and I've always been drawn to the theater. And I do think there is a big difference. If you look historically, Verdi and Puccini knew their place. They were in the theater. You don't hear a lot of chamber music or symphonic work by those composers. And the same with composers whose home was the concert hall, like say Brahms, and a few have crossed over, and some magnificently, but it is very rare that someone is good at everything like Nico is. Nico, I hate you.
I know.
You're good at everything. But when I have just a purely instrumental piece to write, it's very challenging for me because I yearn for that human voice and the theatricality and a character and a situation and a conflict or a transformation that's being worked through with words and music. That is my home. And so that's why primarily I write for the voice and for great singers who I adore, and for opera and the stage. And I do think it's a natural affiliation. I love storytelling. I love movies. I love novels. I love short stories. I love conversations with people. I love collaborating, and if you don't like collaborating, forget opera.
Yes, correct.
All right. To you, Nico.
All right. Well, I mean, I couldn't agree more. I mean, it's just to say, what your relationship to opera and to theater is so fluent, and we should all be so lucky to learn from that. Where when I say fluent, it's like the entire thing feels conceived as a perfect piece of theater, which is something that is very difficult if your background is in any other thing, right? Mm-hmm. And that's always a thing that I think for me, because I come from choral music, from concert music, you're learning a little bit on the road with opera, because it's a much more intense degree of collaboration. Where, for instance, if someone commissions an orchestra piece, right? Essentially, what they're doing is here's a bunch of money, give us a bunch of paper. and then, then we'll perform it or not or whatever. Whereas with an opera, it's this multi-year process of deep technical and emotional engagement with collaborators in ways that are kind of unimaginable. And so as you say, it's like if your home is in the theater, then that comes very fluently, especially, and that comes across in your work. But something I actually wanted to ask you, Jake, is that I've heard, this is going to sound crazy, I've heard so much of your music in the traditional way, but I've also heard it with singers as audition pieces. And that is something that I actually find really moving, because
it's very touching.
Because it really, like, that we should literally all be so lucky, because if you have a singer who feels so connected to what it is that you've written for that voice, that they want to bring that as an embodiment of their musicality and their musicianship, I think that's a testament to some serious engagement.
Well, I mean, but I think, and I know that you know this, and Sasha, you're a part of this. When you know who you're writing for, and yes, you're writing the character, but you need to know who's going to be the first person to do that. They're the ambassador for that piece, for that character. So making it as specific for that person as possible. And then if you write the role or whatever it is really well, then suddenly 100 people show up who can do it or who want to do it. But if you make it sort of gray and vague, no one's going to get it and no one's going to understand it. So being clear and specific, right? When you're writing a violin concerto or a flute piece for the great Carol Winsence, who I know is here, our wonderful friend.
Carol in the chat. Hey, Carol.
Hey, Carol, we love you. That's a very, are you writing a piece for flute and piano, or are you writing a piece for Carol Winsence and piano? That's a very different thing. It's like when someone says to you, write a piece for soprano and orchestra. It's like, there's like 100 different kinds of soprano. What kind of soprano are we talking about? And, so clarity, and then making it specific and getting into visualizing that person on the stage. And then I actually learned a lot about this from my friend Stephen Schwartz. I don't know if you know Stephen, but when he wrote Wicked, okay, the role of Elphaba is ridiculous. You are belting high D's and all this stuff. And he said, but if you write, he said, it's amazing. I thought Idina was going to be the only person to sing that role. And then all of a sudden, all these people showed up who could do it because the role was compelling and fascinating and great. It's like what roles that great singers want to do are sometimes impossible. Violetta or whoever, crazy. And yet everyone wants to do those roles.
It creates, what I was going to say about Wicked, it's now created a generation of kids who can do that crazy Mordant that she does.
Yeah.
You know what I'm talking about? It's so crazy. And literally, it's like you'll be anywhere in the world. You go to Iceland, you can go to Singapore, and you'll be walking in the street, and like a little girl will be all dressed up and doing that crazy ornament. Which, if you or I had written that 15 years ago, they would have been like, what if I just did like a trill?
But he also knew that she could do that. So, right. I mean, I don't know if you do this, but Sasha knows. I mean, when I write a piece, I'm hearing that person, and then I give it to them and I say, if there's anything that's uncomfortable or that you could do better on a different vowel or a different this or in a different octave, let me know, because I want it to sound great, and Sasha's really collaborative that way.
I mean, Sasha, have at it.
So many thoughts, but you said a word that I kind of want to hit. It hits home for me, which is collaborative. I had these memories of both of you, and most recently Nico, when we were creating Marnie. There was always this energy in the room of, what do you think? How do you feel about it? Do you want me to change it? Is it working well? Do you like it? And I think that is really crucial. And I have worked with composers who are like, oh no, this is it. I don't change it. No, we're not changing anything. This is what it is. And then you think, to what end, right? We want everyone to soar. We want everyone to feel comfortable because they, at the end of the day, represent us. So to everyone watching, what I'm talking about is maybe adding a couple bars because they have to move stage scenery. Or maybe changing a high note because there are too many. Or maybe this is an intimate scene, and it's just being flexible. I think you both are uniquely collaborative and humble, and that you recognize that it's about everyone and not yourself. And I don't think all composers are this way. And when I think about, I'm working on Jake's intonations right now because we're going to do a video version, which everyone can watch. It's going to come out August 7th at Cabrillo Festival. It'll be so cool. Anyway, and you can listen to the recording right now. I'm also working on a song by Nico that he wrote, which is so magical for a project that I'm doing, a commission project. And when I think of both of those things, if I play the first 2 bars, I know it's you. I know it's you. There are a lot of composers, and I would say this is true in opera too. You know, whenever I talk to composers about this, which I have to say, it's not fun to have to dissect what makes a good opera, which is what I'm kind of saying we do right now. But if I have to break down, oh, this doesn't work or that doesn't work, it really feels just laborious. So when you get a score and you're like, oh, this feels great, I get it, I'm getting the emotion. And when I'm playing back, learning your music, that's how it felt. It was like, this is easy. This was always meant to be this way. And I've thought this about singers too, about that having a unique voice. Oh, that's Nico. That's Nico's music. That's Jake. When you hear me, hopefully you're like, that's Sasha within
Totally.
bars. And
Immediately.
Bars? What are you, crazy within the first?
Right. I remember first time I heard you, Sasha, it was Les Troyens at San Francisco Opera. And you walked on stage and you were glowing. And out came this voice and I went, well, hello, there it is.
Yeah. You know? The first time I heard you live, Sasha, it was in Dr. Atomic, which is way too late, by the way. But it was just one of those things where I was like, oh, am I in your light? Like, what's going on? Like, I'm blinded by this.
Hey, we're all blinded by your light. But no, that idea of having, you know, when you're collaborating on a piece, especially a big theater piece, because the last character to show up to an opera is the audience. And until then, it's all abstract, it's in our heads and we're in love with it, but we have lost perspective. It's very easy to do in a big piece like that. And so to have friendly ears and eyes on it from the beginning that you trust, who will tell you the truth in a kind way, thank you, but will tell you the truth, you know, not like my mom. My mom will tell you the truth very bluntly. She even gave me the title of my autobiography. I made the mistake after a workshop of saying, so Mom, what did you think? Oh, and she said, and this is the title of my biography. Well, I found it very confusing, but some of the music was pretty.
Well, see, my mom
Anyway.
would say everything is good. I think Nico's mom will also be like, oh, it's great, right?
But being open to hearing from
I want some questions. But you know, Jake, I actually had a question for you because I you know, what Sasha was saying about the flexibility of composers, like coming from instrumental music, you know, you collaborate in this, but one of the most formative experiences I had was at ENO in the beginning of the process of Two Boys when we got on stage. You know, I'd never been on, as a composer, a grand opera stage, right? And it hadn't occurred to me, and this, I realize I sound like the most ignorant person in the world, but it's not something that you're taught. You know, singing a song cycle or singing something in front of an orchestra is one thing. Being in like a corset, covered in blood, in, you know, 14th century Padua, on a rake stage like this, with lights like here, and you can't hear shit, and it's coming from here, and there's all this projection, and all these crazy people, and all this stuff passing in front of you that you can't, and the conductor is like 5 miles away. It's a whole different conversation.
Right.
And if any composers are listening here, like, I cannot encourage you enough to haul your ass onto a stage if you can, and stand in a place. And also because directors, you know, they don't want you all the way down stage. They want you to do interesting stuff upstage.
Right.
And it really is life-changing. And it was 30 seconds that I was up there, but you realize so much that it is our job as composers to set Sasha up for this experience of being,
to succeed too, you know, and to succeed, to set them up to succeed. I agree with you 100%. I think composers and other people involved in the art form should go on stage and see what that is like. Because then imagine that you're out there, you're trusting all this to work, you have your courage, you have your costume, you have your colleagues, and then someone forgets an entrance, or someone in the orchestra messes up and there's a light shining in your face and suddenly you're caught in someone's costume. You know, that's why I think opera singers, my mind is blown by what you have to do to train all of this, but then to be present on stage, to glow, to be in character, to communicate that way. It's so courageous. I am in awe every moment.
It's no wonder we're neurotic and crazy, right? It's so much.
Celebrate it.
Yeah.
Right.
So what
But
makes for a good opera and what does not? What is a story? Someone says, "Hey Nico, would you ever set this to an opera?" And you're like, "No, that would not make a good opera." Or maybe yeah.
What I have found is intimate stories with large forces at work, you know, that are beyond anyone's control. So a really intimate story, not too many characters, and large forces at work. And that could be many, many, many things, but that's something. And then a transformative journey. There was something is very different at the end than here, and high stakes. They're hard. It's hard to find the right story with, you know, not just for you as a composer, but for your whole team. And that's something that the opera company is excited about and can support, and the board and the donors, and that you have to be, and you can be the cheerleader for the years that it's going to take. What about you, Nico?
I totally agree with you, and I think a bigger question about this is, you know, are you working with a totally original story? Are you working with the adaptation of something? Are you working, you know? And I think what we're seeing right now is, I think, a wonderful stable of adaptations, and I think that's great. Sometimes because the three things that I've written are, one is an adaptation of the novel, one is an adaptation of the news, and another is an adaptation of the news. And part of one thinks, like, am I missing out on the original story when there's more flexibility, or am I?
Oh, original story. There's nothing harder than an original story.
It's impossible, right?
Really,
It's
really.
impossible. That's why you look historically, and almost everything is based on something that was there before. I think Rosenkavalier is original story, but I mean, very, very few are completely original stories. It's like working without a net, because part of the whole history of opera, of course, why it started with legends of gods and goddesses and, you know, royalty and peasants or whatever, is because everyone knew those stories. And so they knew the characters, they knew the basic storyline, then they could be open to the musical telling of it. Whereas when you go into an opera house and you're getting new characters and costume and new music and words, if you speak English, the first thing your ear is going to try to do is understand every word. And then beyond that, it's trying to figure out who that is, what they're doing there. And then sort of the last thing you get is the music, you know, and the whole point we're there is because of this musical telling of this emotional journey. So I think original stories are really hard.
Well, I want to remember that comment, Jake, too, because recently we were talking with Gene Shearer about this subject of leaving room for the music in the text. So I want to definitely touch on librettists and how that process has been for you guys. But also, on this note, you both have set controversial topics, things that are not so easy. You know, Dead Man Walking, Dark Sisters. These are big. You know, do you feel like opera is a happy space to explore controversial things, or do you? I mean,
it always has been. Always, it always has been. It always has been. If you look at I mentioned Traviata, that was a huge scandalous opera, you know, back in its day. But it was dealing with something that was socially relevant and important. And if you find the right story, it's not only timely, it's timeless. And if you find like the right story, like as an American composer, I like to tell things through the lens that I'm familiar with. So it might be an American story, but it's also universal. So timely, timeless, very specifically something I could tell, and universal. You know, so it was challenging.
I mean, as Bill said before, I mean, you took on one of the scariest and most difficult to talk about things about being an American with Dead Man Walking, and you know, it's been performed 767 times, and which means that there's a hunger for that form of, confrontational is the wrong word, but that form of intense, you know. And when I say a hunger, it's like that that story is one thing, but the opera is such a vehicle for a really specific kind of storytelling that people are desperately hungry for. And I think so. So Sasha, to slightly flip your question, it's like occasionally people will ask, "Why don't you just write a comedy?"
Again, nothing harder.
I mean, part of me is like, have you looked outside? You know what I mean? Like it's, which isn't to say that there isn't a comedy in all of us, but to a certain extent, I'm not sure what I specifically would have to offer, because I'm more interested in these things that leave you with an unclear moral standing.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I don't know what your feeling is, but I don't like this sentiment I've heard said to composers like, when are you going to write an opera? You should write an opera. I'm like, well, no, don't venture down that path unless it feels right. That should not be forced, and that is not for everybody.
No.
And I'm curious what you think sometimes when you go to an opera that doesn't work. For me, something you said came to mind, which is that when too much is shoved into a show,
Yeah.
if they're trying
and too
to
many
the
words
history of the world, and then it's like a theater piece put to music, and it's just a bunch of words. It's like, well, no, we need. I've thought about this a lot, because I feel like it's more often than not that I don't enjoy a new piece.
Mm-hmm.
Oh my God.
I'm sorry.
But I think
when it comes to opera, I love a lot of new symphonic, a lot of new, and I think, what is it that's not working for me? And then I think, am I being too critical? And one possible theory is emotion. When I think of Falstaff, we understand what's happening without understanding the Italian.
Yeah. That was always my goal, was to write something where if you didn't understand a single word, you'd still know what was going on emotionally. Because if you would see a great Italian, Russian, Czech, French, German opera, whatever, you know emotionally by listening what's going on. And the thing with opera is it is about big emotions and a musical and vocal response to that, to the conflict and the emotion that arises from it. And so in an opera, it's more about an emotional trajectory. And what happens is when there's too much information or too many characters to take in, that emotional trajectory keeps having to be reset. And this is also true if you jump around in time a lot in an opera. The emotional trajectory has to be reset, and the audience has to go back and then go back and forth, and they can lose their way. And remember, an audience generally will give you one chance, with an opera. I also find another thing that with people who are writing operas today, they haven't listened to a lot of opera or attended them or gone to the rehearsals and seen the whole process. I wanted to bring up a great gift I had, even though it sprang from what I thought was going to be a huge tragedy. I lost the use of my hand to perform, to play the piano for several years due to a focal dystonia. And I had to re-educate it and get it back. And I moved to San Francisco, and I got a job at the San Francisco Opera in the PR marketing department as a writer for the company. So my job was not only to interact with all these artists, but to go to every rehearsal, absorb it, write about it. And what better preparation could there have been for an aspiring opera composer, even though I didn't even know I was an aspiring opera composer. I had no interest in writing an opera at that point. But then it made total sense. And I think that experience is part of it, learning about singers, their needs, what you can demand on the stage, what makes a good story, what moves it forward. If you look at classically successful operas, very few scenes, Again, I go back to Traviata. Each act is one setting, and you maximize the emotional content of that. And that's true, Figaro, all the great operas, from the past. It's not really about a bunch of different settings. It's about the emotional content of what's happening in that moment that you maximize. So you can sing about falling in love for 10 minutes, even though in a play you'd say, I love you. This is what opera can do that nothing else can do. And finding the team that understands that. And like you mentioned with librettists, I've been so lucky, first with, Terrance McNally with Dead Man Walking and Great Scott, which was an original story comedy, Shoot Me. But also Gene Shear, who's such a great collaborator and understands it so well. And part of the issue historically, and I'm going to stop talking in a minute, with new work is too many words and not enough, musical content. So I keep telling young composers, don't just set words, write music, and there's a big difference. And having that relationship with your librettist, where you can say, look, the music is taking me this way. I think these aren't the right words, or I might need different words. Or you know what, I'm learning this about the character because of the music. Maybe we don't need this scene at all. We can do it with some staging, I mean, that kind of stuff. I love cuts. Cuts are awesome.
Everything. I mean, so Jake, I have two slightly like spicy responses to that. Mainly because so for me, growing up in the 80s, if I were to think about widening the definition a little bit of opera, just widening the definition of what we're talking about here. For me, I would say that the three great glass operas, which is to say Einstein, Satyagraha, and Akhenaten, have an enormous power. And they're all in dead languages or in kind of nonsense languages. They're a million years long. They're vocally quite severe. Sasha, have you been?
Not yet.
You haven't done any of those. They're
Did you mention Civil Wars? No.
Not yet. No,
Yeah.
but Civil Wars is later. I'm thinking about the Civil Wars is interesting because that's a whole other like Bob Wilson journey. Yeah. But for me, those three things and Metropolitan Atlas and thinking about making, there are a lot of things that exist outside of.
Absolutely, and 100%. And those pieces are totally authentic to those composers and their voice, and because they have this great awareness of theater in a very specific way and how it works for their specific voice. So I wasn't saying that there's only one way to do things. I'm just like, if you look at the big trajectory, of what has worked time and time again, time immemorial. Yes, there are variations on that because all of a sudden there's Wozzeck, historically. All of a sudden there's Yenufa, and it's like, what?
The House of the Dead, and yeah, exactly. Well, Sasha, one of the things that so also, Jake, I should say, I've written two of the larger operas take place in a million different locations, but there's always kind of one person on stage, which is a whole different question. But actually, Sasha, I'm going to ask both of you two questions. Number one, I think those glass operas, mainly Satyagraha and Akhenaten, are gifts to directors, right? Whereas I think with Jake, for you and me, working with a librettist, sometimes a great libretto is a gift for us, right?
Totally.
All three of my librettists, Nick Wright and Stephen Karam and Craig Lucas, I can look at the page and see that it was settable, right? And see that it not only that it was settable, but that you could set it in one specific way, but that it itself could exist theatrically in a million different ways. And the question for Sasha was, what's a thing that you've performed that has existed in two of the most radically different productions? Because I remember one time I saw Cozy at the Met, and then I flew somewhere random in Germany, and then I saw Cozy like at the same time. I had to think, it was like it was the most fantastically not the same thing. So discuss.
I love that though. The first thought came to mind was Hansel and Gretel, because it can be darker or lighter. It can be more geared towards kids or adults. And that changes the feeling for the performers so much, But Dr. Atomic also came to mind because when we did it in New York, it was received differently than it was in London. And I wondered why that was. It was a success in both places, but I felt that the British audience just went crazy for it in a different way, and it attracted so many people. They said 70% of the audience members hadn't been to the opera before, and I thought, well, what is that about? Is it because it's an American story, because it's the making of the atomic bomb? Like, what is it that you know what I mean? And then I wondered what that is, and whether there is something nice about distance. And you both have had your pieces performed in different countries. Is there something there about being an American composer, not just a composer, but being American? Is there a certain association or expectation or, does that bring anything to mind?
I'm looking at you, Jake.
Okay. Well, first of all, I can't help but be an American composer. It's who I am. You know, I'm the sum total of all the musical influences in my head and my heart. But it's interesting is that Dead Man Walking is now done more in Europe and other countries than it is. I mean, it's still done in the United States, but like tiny companies in Germany are staging Dead Man Walking. You know, it's done in Oslo. It's done in Spain. You know, it's like, well, what is? I asked the head of the opera in Madrid, Joan Matterbosch. He told me he was going to do this, and this woman came up to him and he said, so what is it about, you know, that issue that interests you? And he goes, what issue? And she said, well, the death penalty. And he goes, well, I don't think of it as an opera about the death penalty. It's a big human drama. That's what interests me, you know? And so it is a different perspective. We get very focused on sort of the social issues of these things, and we can get lost in the weeds on that rather than the big storytelling. But I actually wanted to respond to something you said, Nico, when you mentioned Philip Glass and Meredith Monk, and all of us actually here in the United States as composers, we have been inundated, of course, with movies. Movies changed everything, you know, from the 1950s or even earlier, 40s, 50s onward. Movies have influenced what we see on stage and how we think of what's possible on stage. And sometimes it's easy to forget that they are very different media, and that what works really well in a movie is not necessarily going to work well on the stage. And yet there are things that do cross over. And that's where I think, because a lot of operas nowadays do, you know, newer operas do jump around in time. And that's something that works really well on the screen and is incredibly challenging on the stage.
Well, let's talk about that, because, of course, Nico wrote an opera called Marnie, which I got to do, which was one of the biggest thrills, which is also a movie.
Yes.
And naturally, of course, people came to the opera with that in mind, for better or worse. And I want to talk about people being critical of you, because both of you guys, as I said, have unique voices, which I think is why you're so fabulous. I believe both of you have been criticized for being too beautiful, too lyrical, too accessible. So can that open up any conversation? You know, bravely doing what you do, you know, and with Marnie, I remember thinking, to me, it was an entirely new genre. And I remember there was some article that wanted it to be like this or that opera. Said, well, where's this high note or that? And I thought, that's not what Nico does. That's not the brilliance of this show. And of course, I'm biased because I lived that experience, and it was unique because, I mean, for those that are watching, I was on stage almost 3 hours. I had 13 quick changes, the most gorgeous costumes you can imagine. I felt like a total princess in Ariana Phillips' beautiful fabric and design. And it was a roller coaster. It was this fun thing where I would look at my dressing room at the beginning of the show and say, well, I'm not seeing you for a little while. Here we go. And but it kept me, like, I soared in it because of the way Nico wrote it and because of the way it was constructed. It could easily have been fatiguing. It could easily have been draining. I'm like, oh, I have to count here. What's this here? No, it's just not at all. So, I kind of went down a road, but I'll pass it to you guys.
Not to, but I think we can't control what people expect from an opera. We just can't control it. And I think, if the minute you start worrying about that, you put yourself in this prison of what essentially gay men in their 60s want. Like, and that's also true of, like, if you care what critics say, like in New York City, we are beholden to 3 gay men of 3 different generations and their opinions about what it is that we do. We're all white. And I'm like, okay. Like, sure. Like, all right, and I think that's an issue with opera, is that the people who are the loudest about it are of a specific demographic. But I will say, one of the I love about old opera people, old school opera people, people who love the opera, I can't think of many other art forms that people are willing to really disgrace themselves defending the honor of. And when people are like, "You're destroying opera," like, this is not what I signed up for. Like that energy actually is really important for what we do, because it's so intense, and it represents an emotional connection to what could be a frivolous theatrical experience. The degree of engagement with the audiences, and I'm not saying this as a joke, like, people who really dislike something are disliking it not in a kind of, I don't like that bowl, I don't like that flower, but in a way that relates to their own super private emotional engagement with what it means to have a story on stage. So I really do actually welcome that kind of criticism, because I feel like the world needs it, number one. And number two, it's a form of identifying a deep need for this art form. So, you know, if you mess it up, or not mess it up, but if you don't quite fit into what they, you know, into that narrow slot, what might be desired, you know, it should have been enough. Like, what do you want?
Yeah. But I think what you're talking about, Nico, is the passion. When people are at the opera, it is an active experience, because the bar, what I love about the art form, whoever wrote it, whatever's on the stage, is it is raising the bar as high as possible for all of us, for the singers, for the orchestra, for the chorus, for everyone backstage, front of house, and the audience. I mean, if you go to the opera, just no one, I don't think, goes to the opera just to sit idly there. You are deeply involved, and it takes your participation and active engagement, which is why the responses are, "Oh my God, that was the worst thing I've ever seen."
Oh, good. That's what you want.
You know, I loved it, you know, but nothing, you don't want anyone in the middle. If everyone comes out of your opera kind of going, "That was good," oh, or even worse, "That was very interesting."
Interesting so much. I'm like, did you hear? You know what? The best person. You were saying your mother's a harsh critic. My fabulous critic is always Mark Morris, who comes up afterwards. He's like, "Let me tell you the 9 things I hated," which is so useful.
I have this
and then for
problem
next
with
time you fix them.
I feel audiences do this with singers, because, and I've had this theory that they think they know you really well because you've shared your soul for the last hour. So they'll come up and say, "You've really improved your high." And I'm like, "I didn't ask you. Don't tell me what you think." Yeah, it happens way
then they go
often.
home and like sniff their callous CDs, you know? Like,
Right. No, but it's I think it's great. And actually, I see a lot of younger people starting to get interested in opera because they have an experience that is visceral with it, and they realize this is something special. I mean, I love student matinee audiences the best, because they'll boo and they'll cheer and they get really vocal about it, which is so exciting. And then they're talking about it in the lobby afterwards or on the way home. I had a student matinee of a piece of mine, It's a Wonderful Life, a couple of years ago in San Francisco. And Flicka, our friend Flicka von Stade, brought all these students. And not only were they screaming and cheering or booing or whatever for what was going on, she said the whole way home, they all came on the BART train. The whole way home, they were singing Auld Lang Syne, which is the last thing that everyone sings. It's a sing-along at the end of the opera with Auld Lang Syne. And they were all singing it together. And I just thought that just speaks volumes, that they were still singing it and carrying it home and talking about parts that they liked and disliked. And I think, you know, everyone through this pandemic, what we've learned is that we all have to be ambassadors for this art form. You know, we have to bring people with us, bring them into the fold, let them know how fun it is. Nico, you and I as composers, we spend so much time alone. You know, composing is a very solitary thing. And when you do get to collaborate, it's kind of amazing and wonderful. But we have to be ambassadors for it. We have to encourage young singers, children, you know, all of these people to be ambassadors for the art form so that it can continue to grow and broaden. I think it's a really exciting time.
I know we have to wrap up in a few minutes, and that brings up one maybe last question. Or if anyone wants to comment with a question you're dying to ask, feel free, and I'll see if I can spot one more. But the other day I was talking to the baritone Joshua Hopkins, who recently premiered a piece of Jake's called Songs for Murdered Sisters, which You can still watch Until Tomorrow on Marquee TV for free. And he was one of the people that I connected to about this interview. And he said, when you're feeling stuck, which I think is a kind of nice, related to the pandemic, a lot of us feel stuck and a lot of us feel a loss of identity. I've been lucky to be in touch with both of you during this pandemic, and I find inspiration just even talking to composers, because I feel like they're doing what they do. They're in their space, they can create, they can really be themselves. But I'm sure you've struggled too. And I'm sure the pandemic has affected you. You're not going to performances, you're not going to premieres, you're not being regularly inspired in the way you would be. But Josh's question was, and I think this is just a great question in general, but also nice to know from a composer who has this pressure to write. The deadline is there. The opera house is waiting for the score. How do you find inspiration when you feel stuck? Is there something you do? Is there someplace you go? I mean, I know I've been low on a number of occasions during this pandemic. And I tell singers, if you don't want to sing, don't sing. If you need, I don't believe in forcing yourself to sing, because we are supposed to be authentic and speaking our truth. And if our truth is not there and we don't feel present or full to share, don't share. It's okay. But how is that as a composer, and how is it as a composer right now?
All yours, Nico.
I mean, so Sasha, thank you for this question. I'm very happy to say that I have no interest in sugarcoating anything about the pandemic. It's an absolute shit show. There's nothing good about it. And everyone was like, you must love, the time is such a gift. And it's like, I wish I had kept the receipt, like, I don't want this gift. Like, it's, and one of the things it did was taught me something a little bit ugly, right? Which is that we're meant to think the music is the music. I could exist in a box. I could exist and just do it and whatever. And then you realize, like, it's not just going to performances, right? But it's that magical thing of being in random city and knowing, oh, Sasha's also here doing this random opera, and I'm only here for a day, but I'll go to their dress rehearsal. It's these serendipitous connections that make the kind of web of what we do so magical. And it doesn't matter if you're working in this international scale or if it's like, 8 people. It really is just about there's a social element to it that I felt kind of superficial, realizing that was the thing I was mourning. So it wasn't like I lost 10 performances and all this money, or whatever it is. It's less that than more, as you know, Sasha, it's like being in a rehearsal. It's, to me, and Jake, you'll know that I hope agree, being in a rehearsal where it's really tense, right? Where something is messed up and the proportions are all wrong and the tech is all crazy and everyone's arguing. Going out for a drink after that, or going out for a meal after that, with not everyone or some people, there's something so, I hate the word cathartic, but there's something so wonderful about that we took for granted, I think. And so for me, this has been really, really difficult.
Yeah.
And I haven't really found the right outlet for stuckness, aside from, and Sasha, here's where I'll disagree with you, is I make myself write every day, even if it's 4 notes, even if I'm just cleaning up clutter from an old score. But Jake, I wonder, like, has your process, have you found that same thing where it's like, I just feel like if I don't write for a day, I'll forget how?
Well, during the past year, I mean, we were talking before this all started, everything from before this year now feels so long ago. And it's really challenging to remember how I did it. But I know that what you were talking about, Nico, being crazy busy is when I can be really creative, because everything's firing and then you don't have time to think about it endlessly. You just have to do it. And there's something to that. You can't process and agonize over it every day anymore. You just have to write it, and then see what happens. But it has been unbelievably challenging. And I was writing like a demon in March and April of last year. And then as it started to become obvious that everything was going to disappear for a long time, I didn't write anything for months. I would show up every day, because showing up is very, very important. So I would show up to my desk in my studio every day. But sometimes I would just be cleaning or organizing because absolutely nothing was going on.
Sharpening pencil. Great.
Right, right.
Sure.
And I suddenly realized, like in August of last year, that what was happening was I was resisting the uncertainty. I was trying to fix it and put it in its place. And when I stopped doing that and I just sort of leaned into it and recognized that it's just uncertain and it's going to be uncertain for a while, and I stopped using all my energy resisting it, suddenly ideas started happening again, and I was able to write. I haven't been writing as fluidly as I have, but I have been writing. And part of it is showing up every day. Part of it is long walks. I've been able, the past year, my husband and I have been able to have dinner together every night. We've been able to take like 2-3 hour walks all over San Francisco every day. And that's when I find I get a lot of ideas too, is just walking. But it has definitely been extraordinarily challenging. And I think everyone has to give themselves a pass for this past year. You know, there are so many should-haves on our shoulders, and I'm telling people, don't should on yourself, because we've all have a lot of shoulds, you know, going on. I should have been done with this. I should be doing this. I should stop it. You know, we are where we are. Once it starts to roll again, it will come back. And it's the chaos and the ritual of travel and being busy and deadlines and performances. Those rituals are what create the possibility for that magic, I think.
And Sasha, I mean, you must, the big thing that I thought about at the beginning of this was actually specifically about opera singers, and kind of specifically about you, but it's awkward to talk about. But it was like, you know, the degree to which, and for everyone who's listening, the degree to which stuff really went away is immeasurably weird, number one. And number two, no one knew how much away it was going to go. And part of me thought, you know, if in March they were like, okay, check it out, it's going to be 18 months, deal with it. Right. I would have said, that's the worst thing I've ever heard. However, you know, but instead it's this kind of attrition, and this went away, but then they were postponing this, but you can do it, but you have to be in a mask. And it, you know, and Sasha, I'm wondering if you could, if you wouldn't mind sharing the anguish of that, because as you know, the myth, of course, is that composers can still write, and that's fine, you know, even though we were all suffering in our own ways. But you know, you're in this position of, again, you're a communicator where the vehicle through which you communicate was fundamentally erased.
Yeah, it feels still surreal, and it doesn't get easier. And as you said, I was like, okay, lost the spring. Okay, sure, I'll find something to do.
I was like, the last 2 weeks of March. Okay.
Oh, yeah, exactly. Oh, the summer. Oh, the fall. Next year, we're losing 21, and now I've heard of artists losing 22, and everything getting shifted. It's so I still mourn every loss. It was very bizarre to fly to France recently, go through the quarantine, the rehearsals, all the PCR tests, and at the last minute it was canceled because a couple people tested. I was just like, I don't know how to feel. I often go a little bit numb, you know, and at least in that case, we got to make music together. We did have rehearsals, and that was something. And then I recently got to be with orchestra. We talked about that before, and that was so special. It was like a part of myself was returned. And Nico, something you said about the camaraderie, I think I've heard a couple musicians talk about my people. I'm not with my people. When you're not with artists in a room, when you're not having a drink afterwards, you feel really alone. And what I haven't liked is, as a singer, we're supposed to be kind of, you know, looking like it's easy, you know, and glamorous and fancy and show up prepared. And we can't really show the hardship and show the vulnerability of the truth of our lives, that it is very lonely, that it is up and down, that it is so unstable. And now it's just smack dab right in our faces. And as one of my colleagues said, I almost feel the worst for my most successful friends because they didn't have a side hustle. And I was like, yeah, thank you. No side hustle, no backup job. Haven't been doing anything else except singing. And singing, or I should say music, the entire purpose for me, my favorite thing about being a musician is that we're all in a room together having a human experience.
Yeah.
And that is precisely what we can't do during COVID. And so
No.
throughout, it has felt very surreal that the very thing, the most beautiful aspect of what we do is precisely what can't happen. And I see people rehearsing in masks and I still don't believe them. Like, is that actually happening?
Like with a flute.
Yeah, I have all these virtual projects still happening, and I'm glad people have gotten creative. I love that people
Yeah.
have stretched, but it still feels like another universe.
Right. Because it's about being in the room. Everything we have worked our entire lives for is about being in the room.
And
You know?
also, I mean, Jake, it's like if you think about also the other thing about being in the room, and Sasha, this is the same for you. If you think about proportion of time spent writing a thing or learning a thing and being in the room, the being in the room is actually not that much time, right? Because all the three of us have spent unbelievable amounts of time alone with our own selves, messing up, feeling so stupid and crazy, and you know, smashing our heads against for three different reasons, or you know, whatever. But then to realize that it is actually that thing that is so important.
That's the goal. It's the goal. Being in the room together, feeling the vibration together. That's the thing that you miss online. You don't feel that vibration right to your core. And being in a concert hall or an opera house and feeling that vibration and sharing it with 2,000 or 3,000 other people. My God, there's nothing like that in the whole world. And that's the goal. And that's what we've been deprived of. And it is a huge deprivation.
It feels like we're somewhat on the other side-ish. We are getting closer. So I want to thank everyone who came to watch. It was so nice. And
get vaccinated.
Get vaccinated, please. It affects us
today.
And our performing. I have friends like, I don't know if I'll get vaccinated. I'm thinking,
oh my God, give me their number. Sasha, give me their number. I will come tonight.
I mean, they don't realize what they do has an impact on me, on my livelihood. You know, it sounds bizarre to say, but I'm like, your actions affect whether we go on. I think a lot of professions, we've talked about loss of jobs, but the amount of shame that we as artists feel, I think hasn't really been explored enough. You know, the sports, they're all back, they're in spaced out, you know, a lot of people have made, but we can't. So, but it's coming back. So.
It's gonna be, you know, Sasha, I was joking that, like, you know, in the beginning of this opera would be the last. I said this last April. I was like, opera will be the last because it's essentially people over the age of 50 being spat at for 3 hours. More or less. And we hope that it'll be people in their 30s and 40s being spat at for 3 hours.
I think it couldn't be a better note to end on.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, everybody, and thanks to Classical Conversations for having us.
Well, thank you all so much. Really, really, this has just been fantastic. Thank you. You've really opened your hearts to us, and we all appreciate it. And it gives us hope, right? We're all in that moving forward feeling. So I also want to thank everyone, of course, who's come here tonight to join, but please join us for our second conversation that we are having for the Hamlen-Palm Series on Sunday, May 2nd at 5 p.m. Eastern Time with violinist Lila Josefowicz and composer John Adams, hosted by Sen Gupa, Director of Artistic Programming for Carnegie Hall. And I know Tom probably wants to say a little send off.
Hey everybody, really, Nico, Jake, and Sasha, that was just a brilliant conversation. It was like a masterclass on what it is about to be an artist. Thank you so much for that. I really appreciate it. And I also want to congratulate Denise and Knox, my colleagues, on a terrific evening. Thank you very much. And Bill, thank you for joining us and kicking this off as well. It's been wonderful to hear and have some chat conversations with folks. On behalf of all of Broadway Cares, Classical Action, DRA, and Charlie Hamlen, I say thank you, much love, and good night.
Thank you. Thank you.